and welcome to the podcast where three friends discuss environmental policies from around the planet.
Hi guys, we are back with yet another episode. And I am joined here by Ala today. Unfortunately, Abha could not join us, but she will let you know why in the next episode. Ala, how have you been? What's up with you, girl?
I'm good. It's gonna be my birthday next week.
Whoop, whoop, exciting!
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Girl, show some more excitement. Come on.
No, it's just like birthdays are just like, okay, another year's come around. Cool.
Another year where you're smarter, better, wiser, wonderful.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And I do love to be smarter because I always feel like we can all be smarter.
You're definitely smarter than last year because now you are a whole year into your grad school that you were not into last year. Mm-hmm.
That is so true. This time last year, I was wondering if we were going to close schools and trying to make a plan for my students.
Exactly. And this time, here you are, knowing a lot more about the environment. And come on, we have to be celebrating this birthday because we have a new podcast, which is our baby. So we have a baby.
Oh my God, we do have a baby. Aw, yes.
Okay, so last time we ran out of time to discuss a very important topic that, you know, we've been meaning to discuss for a while, which is the Indian farming laws. Mm-hmm. And we both have a lot to say about it. So did Abha. So what the Indian farming laws essentially are these new reforms that the Modi government have introduced that will sort of loosen rules around sale, pricing and storage of farm produce. And it's kind of protected, like these rules are the rules that have protected Indian farmers for decades. And what they will do is they will allow private buyers to hoard essential commodities for future sales, which only government authorized agents could do earlier. And then they outlined rules for contract farming where farmers tailor their production to suit a specific buyer's demand. One of the biggest changes is that farmers will be allowed to sell their produce at a market price directly to private players, which could be agricultural businesses, supermarket chains, and even these online grocers that we see popping up everywhere now. I thought that it was just being badly handled by the government and just being politicized by the opposition to just, win some points up their favor. However, as I read more about this, especially for this section of our podcast, I realized that that particular ego that I talk about from like the premier of the country, it kind of reflects in the fine prints of the bill. It's not just about bringing in the big corporations to agriculture. Like, I understand they're trying to do it to boost the economy, which I do think is important. It is essentially a warfare on the farmers by taking away all their ammo. Right?
I see what you mean, yeah.
And they've empowered big corporations. For example, did you know that if a corporation violates a contract with a farmer, the new laws prohibit the farmer from seeking redress in a regular court?
Wow.
Now this...
I did not know that part.
Yeah, and this legislation, it further helps big businesses by removing... And they also remove, restrictions on stockpiling food grain that were essentially put in place to discourage firms from artificially raising prices. Now, I do believe that big corporations are needed in agricultural markets, and I think the Indian government's new laws would have been way more acceptable had these policymakers shown any bit of sensitivity towards the need for antitrust enforcement to kind of level the playing field for the millions of farmers who would really be pitted against a few large firms. And kind of trying to create this monopoly will really hurt the small-term farmers.
Yeah. Imagine monopolizing food.
Exactly. And I think, like I said, I think the bills themselves are not bad because we do need, especially with rising climate change, I don't think these farmers will be able to, just on their own, or even government subsidies. We know the government subsidies in agricultural sector around the world are really huge. India itself spends something like $11 billion in agriculture subsidies, right? Yeah, but the thing is, the way that these subsidies have worked in the past, I think that's what they're trying to do, cut government subsidies. But you can't do that because agriculture, it's literally the bread and butter of India. You can't give these big corporations like a play all card for everything. Like they've taken completely any sort of autonomy from the farmers. And I understand why they're protesting.
I do too. Girl, a lot of very good points were made. Myself, it's not like I'm not anti-capitalist entirely, and I'm not anti-socialist either. Like, I think a little bit of both is good. I don't really have a problem with most of socialism, actually. But the thing is, I'm wary of when government initiatives that are supposed to, quote unquote, empower people by giving corporations more control. Like, how are you doing that? I feel like if you're giving really big corporations more control, then you're definitely taking that control from someone. And I know that now Modi has gone back and said, okay, they're going to remain with the minimum pricing part. But the thing is, he hasn't really done anything to show good faith to that. And I don't like this whole thing. Like you said, they didn't really show any sensitivity.
It honestly just shows a lack of respect for the farmers, I'll be honest.
I agree. And the worst part for me is the Essential Commodities Amendment Act, which basically makes provision for the removal of items such as cereals and pulses from the list of essential commodities. And they say they're doing it to attract foreign direct investment to the sector. I know that these cereals and things like this, they are essential. And the reason I say that is because most of the world needs these staples to survive, especially in places with any type of poverty. So you shouldn't mess around with food and agriculture like this and people's livelihood. And that's what Modi did. He fucked around and he found out.
Yeah, and it was his last term, I think. So he's like, let me see what all I can do.
He went too far.
He went too far. But we'll see how it unrolls. So let's move on to our today's topic, which is IPCC. That is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, I know we've talked about other regulatory organizations such as UNEP, IUCN, and CGIAR, which I hope you guys remember the acronyms for these, because honestly, they are a mouthful, and that's the only thing that these organizations are good at, renaming.
Oh my God!
But before we move on further into this topic, we wanted to address any audience question, and the one that we really picked that I found really interesting was that somebody asked if recycling does not work, which we keep mentioning about in every country, because it's more like a developed country thing, I'll be honest. Why do we still promote it as a solution? Ala, what do you think? Why?
Well, first of all, I will say that the reason recycling seems to not be working is because of A, education around recycling, B, provisions of where to recycle them. Easier you make it, the better it will work. But a lot of NGOs are working in recycling around the world, and I think that the more people learn about it, the more people will put their own personal effort into it. And it's one of those things, it's like vaccines. The more people do it, the better it works. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's a perfect example.
That's why we cannot stop doing either. Thank you.
Tell that to your fellow Texans. Let's discuss climate change before we actually get into IPCC. Ala, why do you think climate change is such a big... Why does everybody want to keep talking about it? Even Bill Gates.
Right here, we're going to talk a lot about climate change and its importance. And there's so many reasons that it's important. Something that people don't always think about as the first effect of climate change is infrastructure. So when there is disruption in the climate, these already crumbling roads and consequently the weather patterns that come with them, with the climate change, they destroy them, basically.
I think what people don't realize that when we talk about climate change, it is not about the earth. Yes, we want to protect the earth, but that's because by protecting the earth, we want to protect the most vulnerable. What will happen is that these disasters will keep increasing. We will constantly have these more floods and droughts. And what will happen is it's going to affect humans. Because let's be real, and I've talked about this before, the earth will heal. The earth will always heal.
Yep.
Okay, so now let's actually talk about what we're here to talk about. What is the IPCC? So it's essentially an intergovernmental organization that was created to provide the policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, the implication it holds, and the potential future risks, and also to put forward adaptation and mitigation measures and options. Now, through its assessments, the IPCC determines the state of knowledge on climate change. It identifies where there is agreement on the scientific community and where there is not about topics that relate to climate change, and talks about where further research is needed, so essentially to guide scientists also where there is a lack. The reports that they create are drafted and reviewed in several stages, and they therefore guarantee objectivity and transparency. Now, why do we think it's relevant, and why did we decide to do a whole ass episode on it? Okay, so it is a science-focused organization entirely. It is essentially an organization of governments that are members of the UN or the World Meteorological Organization. The IPCC currently has 195 members, and thousands of people from all over the world contribute to the work of IPCC for their assessment reports and other special reports that they come out with. Now, interestingly, IPCC actually has volunteers that basically take out their time to assess what the scientific papers that have been published every year, and then they provide a comprehensive summary of what is known about the drivers of climate change, its impacts, future risks, and how adaptation and mitigation, like we talked about earlier, can reduce their risks. Now, it is an open and transparent review by experts, and government around the world are an essential part of the IPCC process to make sure that there is objectivity and that there is transparency, and also so that they can reflect a diverse range of views and expertise.
I will say that this organization, out of all the organizations we've done, is the one that is most transparent.
They don't do any work. They don't pay their people because it's volunteer work. I think they have lesser financial players.
You know what I mean? Yeah, I agree with you.
Not taking credit away from them, it's still a really big deal because they do have 195 countries playing with it. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, so through the assessment, IPCC essentially identifies the strength of scientific agreement in different areas, and it indicates where further research is needed. They do not, let me make it very clear and emphasize, they do not conduct their own research. Again, they don't do any work of their own. It is kind of binding whatever work that has already been done in the field. Now, what is the history of the IPCC? It was created by the United Nations Environmental Program, that is now called the United Nations Environment, because... and the World Meteorological Organization in 1988. Like I said, it has 195 member countries. By the way, in the same year, the United Nations General Assembly endorsed the action by WMO and UNEP to jointly establish the IPCC.
Cool.
So the IPCC essentially created the framework for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that entered into force on March 21st, 1994. Today, it has near universal membership. The 197 countries that have ratified the convention are called parties to the convention, and they prevent essentially dangerous human interference with the climate system. And that's the ultimate aim of the Unfcc. In 1995, the Convention of Parties, also called the COP, they invited the subsidiary bodies, specifically the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, which is also called the SBSTA. They have a bunch of acronyms, guys. We don't know why. To submit proposals for future cooperation with the IPCC. Now, this resulted in a joint working group of the SBSTA and the IPCC established the same year. This informal group meets regularly to ensure coordination and exchange of information on the activities of the two bodies. The joint working group is composed of the chairs of the SBSTA and the IPCC and other presiding officers of the convention and IPCC and members of the secretariats, and meetings usually take place during the sessions of the subsidiary bodies. So that is how their governance essentially works. I'm going to pass it on to Ala, who is going to tell us about how this organization works. Outside of these reports, she will also do a brief explanation of their structure, and then we will both discuss the reports and get into their actual impacts and challenges. which we know is the tea you come here for, guys. Take it away, Ala.
Thank you very much, Adwa. I shall take it away. I don't know why I said that. Let's talk about what the IPCC actually does. They don't tell governments what to do. Like Adwa said, they really, really want you guys to know this. It's very important to them, and we'll talk about why later. So they basically put together this rigorous data using scientists, and they share them in reports. They have different types of reports, and we will get into those too as well. So they publish summaries for policymakers as well. That's really what they do as far as impacting policy. And they have these sessions that are like they go line by line, reviewing and making sure of every single line. And then they publish the reports, and they have to be unanimously approved for them to even publish. So they do end up, this summary for policymakers have questions that they ask the policymakers to basically ask of themselves and in their governments. So they try to make these changes. The reports are not predictions. They're reliable guidelines. They are inferences. So in 2007, they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, which they shared with Al Gore, for their efforts to build up and share greater knowledge about man-made climate change, and also for laying the foundations for measures that are needed to fight such climate change. They really set the bar for linking climate change with human activities, and I believe that's really the biggest impacts of these reports, just in my own opinion.
They have to have some impact, right?
Yeah. Oh my God, they do have impact. I'll just stop. But before we get into these reports, I just want to say I think it's very interesting that apart from people who are part of these like working groups and task force, which I'm going to explain what those are in a second, the experts who actually write stuff for the report are all volunteer scientists. Like, yeah, it would be crazy as a researcher to contribute something so life-changing as an IPCC assessment report or special report, but is it giving like Instagram work for exposure vibes, or I'm just really crazy?
Nope, it is 100%.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So they divide themselves, how they get stuff done, into 3 working groups and a task force. Sometimes they'll like establish other task force to take care of something that comes up. So a good example is the decision that they made at the 47th session of the IPCC in Paris in March 2018. We're going to talk about that session a lot, to establish a task group that improves gender balance and addresses gender-related issues in the IPCC. All of the stuff in the IPCC, this big structure, is managed by what they call the bureaus. So the purpose of the bureau is to provide guidance to the panel on scientific and technical aspects of its work. And then they also try to advise them on management and strategy issues. And they try to take decisions on specific issues within its mandate, like how do we deal with errors, for example. That's something that they take a mandate on. The members of the bureau are picked by a panel, like the panel before them, during an assessment cycle. And they last the entire cycle, and they cover like different regions of the World Meteorological Organization, the MTO, which, like Adjo said, is part of what got them started. None of the bureau members are actually paid by the IPCC, which...
See where the transparency comes from, girl?
But they get elected during...
Okay.
The current one that we have was elected during the 42nd session of the IPCC on October 2015. So they'll basically...
Can I just say?
Yeah.
I think it's really mean to not pay scientists because they already don't make enough money. Like, give them money for grants.
No, but the bureau is made up of like different like co-chairs and vice co-chairs and stuff. Yeah, I think the people who are in that bureau are very good. I don't know. But they'll basically last in that bureau until there's a new assessment report released, which after that, then they'll elect new ones again. They also have final say as far as like what really goes into these reports finally, especially if there's a disagreement of any sort. They're the ones who sort it out. So like I said, they split up into working groups and a task force. The first one is based on the physical science basis. So they'll cover like greenhouse gases and aerosols in the atmosphere, temperature changes, land, ocean, hydrological cycle, and changing precipitations as far as like rain and snow patterns. They also look at extreme weather, glaciers, ice sheets, oceans, sea level, biogeochemistry, the carbon cycle, and climate sensitivity. The working group one, the first working group, I feel like covers a large umbrella, right? Because physical science is quite a bit to cover. What do you think?
Oh, I thought you were going to say quite a bitch, because it's also that.
Yes, okay. Yeah, and just anything that is linked to physical science, these guys kind of cover, which is why I guess some of the other ones will interlope with them from time to time. The second group addresses impacts, adaptations, and vulnerability. So while the other one is looking more, I guess, as you can say, like the things that will influence climate change or will be indicators of climate change, this one is looking at what these things, after they've caused the climate change, what will happen next. So they take a worldwide view of ecosystems, biodiversity, humans, so like the anthropological aspect and its impact as far as what humans are doing, societies, cultures, as they change, how will climate change as well? And then they consider vulnerabilities and capacities and limits of the natural and human systems that we currently have to adapt to the coming climate change, and so that we can reduce, climate risks and things like that. It's basically helping with climate resilience, like seeing what is the impact, what are we doing, what is happening to us. And then this information is going to be used to develop approaches to mitigate and adapt to climate change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then the third working group is more solution oriented. But they're very clear, once again, that they are not advocating for any specific mitigation options. And I think this is another reason that they tell people like this is not prescriptive. Just with all the drama we have around climate change, they want to make it clear we are offering you a range of solutions. A lot of people have contributed to this. You can take these solutions and you can fit it to your specific climate. I think that's why they do that. I mean, maybe if they hired people, they'd be able to craft specific solutions, but the way it is and the drama surrounding it, this is what we got. So they take a short-term look, and they also look at a long-term look, and they will look at government, they will look at private sector. They make tons of recommendations. Guys, these things are over 100 pages long. They're not messing around.
400 pages, girl. What are you talking about? 100? Mm-mm.
So, yeah. And they also talk about, what will be the technical feasibility? What will be the costs? And how can we enable our environments to put in the right measures? So that's basically the three working groups, which brings us to the last aspect of their main structure. That's the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. And they have two main objectives. The first objective is to develop and kind of refine and clean up an internationally agreed method and software for calculating and reporting national GHG emissions and removals. So obviously this is a very important thing because people's methods and people's data will vary, and we have to reach a consensus. So these guys kind of set that bar, I guess you would say. And also the second thing, or the second objective that they try to meet, is they try to encourage the widespread use of whatever methodology that they come up with to the countries that participate in the IPCC and are signed to the Unfcc. Like I said, they don't really conduct their own research, but they do get a lot of experts together. So now I'm going to tell you how they take the words of these experts and they turn it into reports. First, they have to identify if there's agreement in the scientific community. So there has to be a lot of research to find grounds and see, obviously, there will be things that people disagree about, but before they publish a report, they do have to make sure that they address agreements, differences of opinion, look at where further research is needed, yada, 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 because otherwise that partnership with the science and policymakers, which the IPCC tries to provide, is not going to happen. So the first step is experts to go in who right, what goes in the report, get nominated by the members. So including the governments, the observer organizations, and the Bureau. They are nominated, and then the selected people who are nominated prepare a draft outline of the report for the panel. Then they have a scoping meeting where the panel will read the report and agree on a general outline and a rough draft of reviews from experts is created as well. So anybody who doesn't get picked to contribute becomes a reviewer, and they're part of this process. So like I said, they really do try to have a situation where there's a lot of contribution, which ends up being both good and bad. We'll talk about that later. The governments, the organizations, the working groups, the task force, and the Bureau then choose a final list, like I said, of experts based on the nominations. The final authors will then go back and they do the summary for policymakers, which, like I said, is all those questions and stuff, and like stuff that you can do to take the science and translate it to actual action, because that's what we care about, a policy. And guess what? Yeah, they review it again. But it's very important. Like, I think because they do this like very intense project, and because they focus so much on it, like you said, that's pretty much what they do. It means that when they put this information out, you don't have a lot of grounds to argue against them. You really don't.
Right. They do their due diligence. And that's why they really do need to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. And so then the authors will get together and make their actual report, first draft. So that's the first report that contains everything. This gets reviewed, again, just by the Bureau this time. And if it's accepted, then there's a final draft. The government members get to review it. Again, you see where they're connecting science and policy. And the working groups plus the panels will then review after the government one last time. Okay, so again, they're not fucking around. There have been 6 major reports since 1990. The first was, like I said, in 1990, and the 6th is coming up next year. They're separated like this. So there's a main synthesis that is a combination of the actual assessment report, which, like I just said, is like very long. And then the special reports during that assessment cycle, as well as technical summaries that's sometimes there, contributions from working groups, and a summary for policyholders. That's what this entire thing is made up of. The main assessment addresses the state of things, like in dealing with climate, depending on the topics from the experts that they choose. Sometimes they'll have a mistake in a report, or well, people will argue that they have a mistake. They have a link where you can submit your errors and stuff. You have to make an account and everything. And then the secretariats of those different working groups, depending on what you're complaining about, will follow a set protocol, which will vary depending on report. We're not going to get into it. It's pretty different, but you can Google it and it'll be in the show notes. And then they'll submit a correction if they think it's necessary. And then if they can't agree, the Bureau will break the disagreement. And then they get that information to the public.
That's the difference between a scientific organization and other regulatory organizations, right? Like, that's how science works. Science is like, you have a better hypothesis, you don't agree with us, tell us, talk to us, and we'll actually review it. Unlike policymakers who are like, you know what, you don't know, we know better, sit down. Oh, God.
And then just filibustering, which is so stupid. Anyway, they also have different types of reports sometimes. And we're going to get into each of the assessment reports. But first, I just want to talk about 2 other types of reports they have. They have the special reports on specific topics, like the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius report. That's a very popular one. And then they have methodology reports, which provide practical guidelines for preparation of greenhouse gas inventories. Because, we have to keep up to date on those. So those are 2 other types of reports that they do. But I just want to take a minute to talk about, like I said, a very popular special report. The report highlighted a lot of major things. There's a lot of cool stuff in that report as far as impacting the increasing global temperatures. But the thing that stood out to me the most was before we used to think, okay, so we can only go 2 degrees above pre-industrial thresholds for climate change or we are screwed. And yeah, the number 1.5 was floated around a lot, and it's a range also too, I should say that. But thanks to this report, it was adjusted and we're like, oh no, guys, we are off. We actually can only go 1.5 above. And I think that that changed a lot about how governments started approaching climate, industry, different things. So we're going to talk a little bit about these assessment reports that we keep bringing up. There are 6 of them, like I said, and I'm just going to go ahead and give us a little summary so we can really understand or at least get the point of the first 3. Joa?
So they had the first 3 reports that I'm going to talk about. Their first assessment report came out in 1990, as we talked about earlier. And they also came out, at the same time, they also came out with a supplemental report that was prepared in 92. And it supported the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCC, like we talked about earlier, at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It is also called the UNCED, commonly known as the Earth Summit, as some of you may already know, and it's held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 92. Now, the UNFCC Treaty, which the United States has signed, it serves as the foundation of international political efforts to combat global warming. Now, the IPCC reports were also influential at the first conference of the parties to the Climate Convention that was held in Berlin, Germany in 95. The attendees produced a so-called Berlin Mandate, which kind of set out the terms for a negotiation process that would produce binding commitments by industrial countries to reduce their heat trapping emissions after the year 2000. Now, this significantly was strengthened by the second assessment report that came out in 1996, along with additional special materials on the implications of various potential emission limitations and regional consequences that provided key input to the negotiations that led to the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol that we all are aware of.
And a fan of, yes, very important. And that was to the UNFCC in 1997. Now, the Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement that establishes binding targets for reducing the heat-trapping emissions of developed countries. Now, after the second assessment report was published, a number of technical papers and special reports have been prepared to talk about the impact of aircraft, land use, technology, and changing emission levels on global warming. And for those of you who don't know, the heat-trapping emissions of a country are basically emissions that affect the ozone layer and also, really emissions that provide a cover and don't allow the heat that gets radiate to the earth to bounce back. So we really do need that heat to also be removed from the earth. It's a cycle. We can't just take the heat. And if there's the less balance there is due to these emissions, the more global warming we have here because GHGs, aka greenhouse gases, get trapped.
And you know what traps the most heat? The oceans.
Yeah, that's
true. Please,
true.
let's protect those. So then they had the third assessment report that came out in 2001, and it essentially concluded that temperature increases over the 21st century could be significantly higher than they previously thought, and that the evidence for human interference on climate change was stronger than ever, even though we don't want to believe it, but it is very true. And it would even become worse than they previously feared if we didn't reduce our carbon emissions. Meanwhile, the world ramped up fossil fuel production.
It's actually so funny. Yeah. You would think that a report like this coming out would shake people to their core, but it did not. It shook people to their argument core. Their debate bone kicked in.
But I think if you see globally, we've become so desensitized at this point because we have so much information. Every day we have news that is telling us one thing is dying or another thing is dying or something bad is happening. That at this point we're just like, you know what? We're very desensitized. So no reports, and especially about the earth.
That's why we all have to keep talking about it. We have to remind people these things are important. Don't forget about them.
Yeah.
So those are the 3 first ones that Joa talked about. The 4th one is, till date, the largest and most detailed summary of the climate situation ever undertaken, and not just by the IPCC, but ever undertaken by anybody. So they covered a lot, as they do, but the main emphasis was that the warming of the climate is unequivocal. Basically, they were saying, I know we've said before that we have a problem and temperatures are rising and we're causing it, yada, 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 but we are here to say that without any doubt, the warming of climate system is not turning around if we don't stop. This is happening, guys. This is for reals, for reals. One thing that stuck with me that they concluded was that they concluded that the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations is possible. We can do it at a reasonable cost with stabilization between 405 parts per million, which is a volume measurement, and 535 parts per million, costing less than 3% of the global GDP. Now, keep in mind, this report was from 2007, 2008, but come on. You know what I mean? That number must not have gone up that much. 3%, we can do it. There was quite a bit of controversy, Lord, around the sea level estimates from this report. It became such a big deal that they had to spend extra time reviewing the numbers because people were like, it's too low. But then, of course, governments were like, you can't set it that high. We can't reach it. They were right, though. And that's why nowadays we talk about coastal communities being underwater between 2030 to 2050. It's happening. It's coming. It's also the report that had such an impact that they won that Nobel Peace Prize I talked about. It is also the report where the UNEP got the summary of what sectors contribute the largest to climate change. You know, when we discussed that in episode 1 and we were like, energy contributes the most. Yeah, this is where they got that from.
IPCC making moves.
Not actually making moves. The fifth report kind of built on the fourth one, as they do. And it added another definitive statement, which said it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. Which, yeah, they brought up human interference before and anthropogenic effects, but people are still arguing about this fact today, and now it's a fact, by the way. I don't know why you're arguing a fact. So at the time, it was a really big deal. It was legendary. They also said that if global societies continue to emit greenhouse gases at the current rates, then average temperatures would rise between 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius by 2100. Another thing that was a big debate. And this is kind of how the Paris Climate Agreement. So basically, after the fourth one, they were like, oh my God, what? And at the UN convention, I think the very next year, after the fifth one, the very next year after that was when the UN in 2015, they were like, all right, guys, we need you guys to issue a special report on this temperature thing. Because some of the countries that are more vulnerable were saying, look, they're saying we're going to be underwater in our coastal communities. You guys have to go back and let people know that the threshold isn't actually as high as 2 because it was debated. And that's how we actually got that special report about global temperatures being a 1.5 degrees Celsius report being our threshold.
Well, if there were anything like the Indonesian government, they'd be like, you know what, fuck it, we'll take it. Let's just move our capital, guys. Let's do it. Pick it up. Let's pack.
Pack it up, people. We're moving the capital. But yeah, the sixth report actually isn't out yet, but it has gone on its way quite a bit. There have been 2 drafts already and 1 review by experts so far. And it is due next year. So I know they're going to have a few more reviews this year. And if they're at the 2 draft state, then right now I think governments are reviewing it. So far, it looks like a big focus of this report will be to pay special attention to impacts of climate change as far as cities and unique adaptations and mitigations for the challenges you have in more urban settlements. It's not like they haven't covered it before, but a lot of the climate change discussion until very recently, we weren't really looking at maybe cities that weren't exactly on the coast yet, but this one is going to dedicate a huge percentage of their effort to it.
I thank you, Ala, for that. Those were the 6 assessment reports. Now we will talk about some of the implications of the IPCC and its reports so far that they have in global policy and science as well. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is, of course, the impact on science, because it is a scientific organization. And so far what we've seen that the result indicate, among other things, that the aggregate impact of IPCC reports on scientific publications has increased through each consecutive assessment report, and it is independent from the increase of the climate change field, which shows a pattern that suggests that the references are quite generic. Both disciplinary distribution and geographical distribution of the impact of the reports are skewed. The former
what does that mean?
Okay, so disciplinary means the organizations and geographical means country-wise. Impact of the reports are skewed. Now, the former towards geophysical science and the latter towards Western and developed countries. Now, however, this skewness is decreasing over time. And that's because given the increasing impact further away from the climate change field, it is important that the IPCC becomes more transparent about its internal processes and main conclusions.
I see what you mean there with that being skewed, because a lot of the reports do focus when they talk about, I guess because the working group controls a big part of it, when they talk about the physical sciences, they don't talk a lot about like species impact and things like that. And there's more geo than there is hydro, for example. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think it would obviously skew towards countries that have more at stake, I guess, like more developed countries especially, right? Because we have a lot more researchers and scientists from these countries, sadly. Okay, so speaking about further implications of IPCC, especially with respect to emissions, because that is, let's be real, their main point. So long-term emission scenarios have served essentially as a primary basis for assessing future climate change and response strategies. Therefore, it is important to regularly reassess the relevance of emission scenarios in light of changing global circumstances and compare them with long-term developments to determine if they are still plausible and considering the newest insights. That is why they keep coming up with new assessment reports every few years, because we have to keep in light the new, like we said, the world is very evolving really fast. So we have to keep changing ourselves. We have to keep evolving if we want to curb and mitigate any climate disaster as we look forward.
Exactly.
Now, studies show that historical trends have been quite consistent with what we've seen, and so they can be regarded as valid inputs to basically take the past and our future analyses of climate change and impacts. Now, global carbon dioxide emissions from 1960 to 2018 comprised 6 overall subperiods of emissions, and their growth significantly was higher and lower than average. Now, what that means is that it was higher in some regions, like we have to look at it geographically. So in some regions it was higher, and then in other regions it was lower. Now, the carbon dioxide emissions in absolute numbers and growth rates are obviously very tightly coupled with primary energy and indirectly with GDP. So global emissions, generally, they followed a high pathway sort of that captured middle of the road narratives. And by combinations of this new global sustainability narratives, it has been, like we've seen, a bit of a high pathway. So historically, we've seen that developing countries trend, they were sort of course, as you would expect, they had rapid growth and they had more regional competition scenarios, while the developed countries trends, they were close to regional sustainability and global sustainability scenarios.
So that's another skewing that we see when we talk about distribution types and when we talk about geotype skewing in those reports, right?
Yeah, because obviously we have to understand that developing countries are, and I think we've talked about this even in our previous episodes, that how when it comes to emissions, developing countries, because they are developing, so they do tend to have a rapid growth of emissions, like we see China, we see India, as opposed to developed countries like the European Union or the US, even though the US is still the highest in emissions. But when we talk about the rate of emissions, it has quite been steady in developed countries as opposed to the developing countries where they're obviously going up.
And that's why models which are based on global sustainability and take developed countries into account a little more. That's why those models are going to match more with developed countries. Yeah, I agree.
Right. And so we really have to, when we talk about global sustainability and everything, we really do have to keep in mind these developing countries.
Yeah, for
because
sure.
they have very important implications for future greenhouse gas emissions and, of course, associated climate change. When we talk about the mitigation of these emissions and the implication that they've held by the IPCC, essentially, that despite 3 decades of warnings by the IPCC, world leaders have done far too little and they have moved far too slowly to actually stop climate change. In 2017, global carbon emissions hit an all-time high of 41 gigatons after 3 years of plateauing due to higher energy demand and a slowdown in investment in energy efficiency measures. As the IPCC's urgent new special report shows, as we've seen, the need for immediate action is obviously much clearer than ever because they have been highlighting this a lot more. And we are coping with the devastation that was wrought by a disrupted climate, from storms ravaging our coastline cities and towns to fires taking lives and destroying homes. So honestly, all you need to do is stop having these gender reveal parties that set the whole state on fire.
Oh my God, stop.
It's true. I'm just going to come out and say gender reveal parties are a dated concept. We need to get over them. And burning forest over it is definitely not cool.
Yeah, definitely.
And this kind of damage, we will see, it will only get worse if we really don't start cutting emissions without any delay. Like, we need to start, like, pronto.
So, yeah, we really do need to start. And one of the things that's stopping us from starting is climate denial. We said a lot throughout this discussion about how the IPCC is constantly trying to influence people's thoughts on the subject and, bring people closer to the science and facts. So I'm just going to give 2 stats from 2 countries. The first is from Australia. The Australian Institute in September of 2018 found that only 76% of Australians accept the reality of climate change, while 11% do not think climate change is occurring and 13% are unsure.
Okay, that's Australia though, and I think 76% is a big number. Let's be real.
So, I mean, it's a big number for most things, but the reason it's not a big number for climate change is when you have 24% of the country that hasn't bought into it yet, you're going to see that reflected in your laws.
Okay, but what about other countries?
Okay, so the other place that I chose is America. Americans are a lot more skeptical, with only 62% agreeing with the proposition that humans are primarily responsible for climate change, and 23% saying it is due to natural changes in the environment, 1% undecided. This was found in Yale. I think it's very interesting that in other countries you'll see a larger percentage of people that are unsure, because, unsure means one side can take it, right? But in America, you see, like, the polarization is even more clear because 23% is like, nah.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Only 1% is unsure, very polarized. Populism is killing politics.
Why can't you just say, I don't know, if you don't have enough information over here? Like, if you don't have enough information, you're just like, nah, it ain't real.
Exactly. And speaking of information, I think that has a lot to do with science journalism. So I still check out science news, but something that I've noticed is most of my science news increasingly is coming from, like, blogs like I Fucking Love Science. That's the name of the blog, and I love that blog. They kind of take stuff from different, like, papers and studies, or it's coming from NASA for me, or it's coming from any of these organizations I follow, like their press releases or research papers. As far as, like, my general news, when I read news, actually, I'm not getting a lot of science journalism the way I used to anymore. It's still there, but it's not as big a deal as it used to be anymore. And so we're seeing more and more of a disconnect between science and policymakers, even though those 2 parts should be married together.
Right. No, I agree with you. And I think, like you said, a lot of it has to do, like we talked about in one of our earlier episodes, is news is so sensationalized. And anything that does not make it to your 24-hour loop thing, it's not there.
Yeah, and even when it's there, like sometimes people be like, the media isn't reporting it. They are, but the problem is a lot of us first hear about a story through social media. What's going to make it through social media to social media is what's sensational. Like, you're going to miss a lot of the smaller stuff. The news organizations aren't posting every single story they publish to social media. So people will see it there, and then they'll be like, all right, I want to hear more about this. But if it's not making it there, like Ajo said, sensation is what's winning. Not to mention that we have to deal with the fossil fuel lobby as well. So the IPCC is using these reports to allow the policymakers who are for these and also the communities to really stand up and have evidence, have something to... In fact, there's a very funny... I think this was in 2018 or 19, where the members of the GOP, I forget the exact person or people, were trying to refute the Global 1.5 report and conclusions from the Fifth Assessment Report. And then, journalists asked them questions like to give their evidence and their science. And all they could say is, we have scientists too, which... They didn't even give the actual science that these scientists, in quote, gave them.
Yeah, no, honestly, I think we have like you said, a much larger disconnect between science and policy. And like you said, it has a lot to do with journalism and the way that information is portrayed to the general public.
Yeah.
And I don't know, this is where I can go on a rant about democracy.
Oh my God, please don't do it. The people are not ready for your views on democracy versus republics.
And, okay, so you know what? I'm not gonna go there. I'm not for either. Let me just be clear. I'm not for either. I don't believe in dictatorship either.
No, obviously, yeah. So the thing also that you have to realize is that after they publish those reports, it has to be adapted, right? And yeah, they started issuing more methodology reports, and Group 3 offers solutions. But like I said, there are a lot of solutions. They're a large range, and they're trying to work to make even larger ranges. There are constraints, though, depending on the sector that you're trying to, take a solution here from to mitigate, trying to adapt from. You will have certain constraints. Okay, so for instance, if you think about agriculture, a constraint might be enhanced drought in certain areas. A constraint might be financial safety net for farmers, like we're seeing. That's the whole debate in India. A constraint might be maintenance of crop yields. So the IPCC will also give you adaptation options, like they'll offer, for instance, that drought and pest resistance, maybe GM crops. Financial safety, subsidizing because it works. Increased use of chemical fertilizer can help with enhancing crop yields and suppressing opportunistic pests and invasive species. So they will issue this report, you will look at these options, and then they'll also provide you with some trade-offs, real or perceived, that you should think about. Like I said, using the example again of enhanced drought, well, if you're going to use biotech and GM crops, unfortunately, you're going to have to think of the trade-off of the perceived, although not real, risks to public health and safety that people have when it comes to biotech in their food, and the ecological risks associated with new genetic variants. Every time you introduce a genetic variants with these crops, you have to also think of how you're going to be affecting that ecosystem. So that's just an example of how these constraints exist. And there's other ones. There's a biodiversity constraints to think of. There's cost constraints. And of course, there are water resource management constraints. So for example, a big one in cost is near-term protection for financial assets from being destroyed or eroded. Now, a possible adaptation option could be seawalls, which we've talked about. However, a trade-off with seawalls is the high, very real, and direct end opportunity costs. We're dealing with them as far as like, how much is this thing going to cost you in the long run, as well as ecological impacts to coastal wetlands. Because seawalls, why do I keep saying world, Scott? Seawalls are good for cities, but they might not be the best for a wetland. So that's an example when I say something like, they will give you constraints to think about, ways to adapt to them, and be like, all right, think about the trade-offs before you make your decision. And they have tons of these for each of these sectors that I talked about. So of course there are some limitations to these adaptations. as far as how you can use these guidelines. There's two types of limits we consider when we talk about adaptation limitations and climate change. We have hard limits, which are limits that don't really change over time, and we have soft limits, which are expected to change more rapidly over time. To figure out what kind of limit it is, they look at whether an adaptation response could emerge in the future, or we already have one, and they also look at how soon it could emerge. So, for example, in Europe, we expect that by 2050, farmers will be limited in how they use irrigation to deal with the heat damage from crops due to constraints from like reduced runoff demand in other sectors. Agriculture and irrigation are tied to runoff, and runoff affects our waterways. It affects our health in the communities depending on what is being run off. As less and less sectors have needs of the byproducts from these runoffs, agricultural sector and farmers, they're going to have to start thinking about what the hell are we going to do with these runoffs, not to mention the lack of precipitation that will happen. So since water management responses and also some cost responses could help this problem, this would be an example of a soft limit. A hard limit would be something like large sheets of ice melting in the Arctic, and we know we're at a point where a lot of these, like, there's no going back, man, like it's melted. Beyond the adaptations to limits, the organization itself does have some issues, some limitations that it does get heat for. A big thing.
Heat. The thing they're trying to stop.
I know, right? Oh my, I'm gonna stop with the dad jokes, but I love them. Some scientists feel that like upper thresholds on temperature estimates aren't strong enough, and that this has dangerous implications. So like they're saying like you need to widen these thresholds, and then some are like saying no, you need to make it even smaller. And also there's models that show that CO2 and CO atmospheric concentrations indicate that we may have already reached the former 2 degrees Celsius threshold for global temperatures, as far as how far we can go from pre-industrialization. But it is a hotly debated topic because, again, it comes down to methodology.
Hotly debated.
Another big concern is the dangerous anthropogenic inferences that Adra talked about. So in most of the world, anthropogenic interferences are steadily on the rise, and studies argue that it is already significant enough to be causing critical temperature and critical GHG thresholds in relation to biome shifts like the loss of Arctic permafrost and sea ice, and probably, but not for certain, also Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. And also, if we think about the structure of the IPCC and how they collect things from everywhere and they have all these reviews, there will be things getting excluded. Like I said, stuff like Adwa mentioned, stuff is skewed. But since they're so vocal about not being prescriptive, and since they're trying to fix this, it can be a little tough to get the scientific community, let alone policymakers, to rally behind them because they're like, oh, you didn't include my stuff. What about this thing? What about this thing? But they have to go with the best of everything put together, guys. As they continue, they're trying to enhance the adaptation limits to become more transformational. So they're trying to make them like more slow processes, more like step-by-step adaptations you have to take so that you shift away from stuff that's unsustainable as far as policy and practices. So yeah, that's everything on the IPCC. Like, I hope you guys enjoyed that. But before I hand over to Audra to kind of wrap us up, I just want to give you guys some organizations to check out. So first of all, we have the Green Climate Fund, a personal favorite of mine because money. And it is a unique global platform to respond to climate change by investing in low emissions and climate resilient development. It currently has like 194 government members. Another organization everybody should check out is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, otherwise known as IBIS. It's an independent intergovernmental body established by different states in the UN to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services, as far as like putting out information for that stuff for the conservation and sustainable use of our ecosystems and long-term human well-being. And finally, we want to highlight what is an organization that does a lot of grassroots work, the Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice. I love this organization as well. We all love it. And it's a global network of organizations, experts, and activists that work for gender equality, women's rights, and climate justice as it relates to sustainability and our planet.
Thank you, Ala, for that. Please do check these organizations out. We will have a lot on our show notes for any extensive information that you want, because we really did have to cut it down, even though there's so much more that we have to say and we can say. So please do check it out if you guys are interested on our show notes. For our next episode, we are going to be getting into grassroots organizations. Now, grassroots organizations are usually these organizations that operate on a local level, that work with districts and local communities, and all three of us actually have our favorite grassroots organizations that we have picked, and we will talk more about them in the next episode. So please be sure to check it out. I promise it will be fun. Thank you so much for tuning in. We do have some questions for you. So do you guys think that convincing policymakers will have an impact on climate change deniers, or do you think it is the other way around? We would love to know what you have to say about whatever you are finding out in your community or any other climate change related queries that you have. You can hit us up on Twitter at Planet Policy Pal, on Instagram at Planet Policy Pals, and like our Facebook page. We do post a lot of insightful information and news about environmental solutions and some fun tidbits and did you knows. So please follow us. Do check out our website, planetpolicypals.com, for show notes, references, and tips on how to support us. Please like, follow, comment, depending on whatever platform you use to listen. And that is it. We will see you in 2 weeks. And until then, keep learning, pals.